Proportional Response, Book 1, Chapter 12, Part 1, Against the Grain. Alira Senzar's talons made a satisfying tapping noise on the keyboard. She felt proud that she had managed not only to master the human's English, but had learned to type with respectable speed. She finished up her report on part distributions for farm equipment, and realized the other 4 desks in the office sat empty. Got lost in my work again, she thought to herself, amused and pleased that the thought came in the human language. She locked her computer and went to the break room where she found her 3 fellow human office mates enjoying their lunch. Sally pointed to the seat next to her, which had a bowl of something that smelled outstanding in front of it. As she sat, Sally spoke up.
We were discussing coming in there and dragging you away from that computer. It is our turn to have you try a human dish, and we were afraid you were trying to weasel out on us.
A broad smile and small laugh from the 3 women took any sting out of the words. She smiled in reply and put her snout close to the dish to take a good sniff.
Weasel out? Oh no, this smells divine. What do you call it? Beef and chicken enchiladas. The tortillas, what they are wrapped in, is a plant-based product, but it is wrapped around 2 of our favorite types of meat.
It took her a couple of tries to get a good bite, but the explosion of flavor that rewarded her was well worth it. She let her eyes flutter closed.
I am glad we started doing these meal exchanges, ladies. This alone make it all worth it. Even worth the broccoli?
She smiled and pretended to consider. They all laughed together. Jen then spoke up again.
I have to agree with you though. The roast gafka was worth the brush with fried penola.
She smiled, nodded, and took another bite, content to let the other women speak. Jen continued.
Honestly though, Ilara, I don't know why you are letting them stick you in logistics with us. You are an engineer, not a glorified secretary.
She smiled back.
To be fair, I have both sets of skills. A voter took an interest in me at one point and decided to make me his personal secretary. I learned how to do the job and do it well enough that he finally stopped forcing other things when I threatened to run.
The others went silent. Sally put a hand on hers and water rolled from her eye down her cheek. The other 2 looked at her with expressions she hadn't learned to read yet. Jen finally spoke.
I'm so sorry, Alira. That is awful. I didn't mean to bring up something so wretched.
Sally spoke.
It is okay now though. You are safe here. If you ever need to talk about it all with us, you can, and there are a couple of trained therapists on site.
She looked between them for a few moments, then dismissed their concern with a wave of her hand.
Those sorts of things are all too common where I came from. One learns to deal with it. It was my own foolish fault for not keeping my ridges out of sight of men with power. I got my own in the end anyway.
She gave them a vicious smile full of teeth.
When we all got the chance to vote to join the humans, the girls and I, well, we heard about the evacuation by the voting class, and we managed to lure him into a room and lock him up.
She giggled slightly.
He never made his ship, and was still there when your people arrived. The girls wanted to, well, you can imagine. I talked them into turning him over to the humans. After all, what is worse for a voter than to hand him to his worst enemy?
The other girls took her words in silence and exchanged looks that she couldn't read. Sally eventually spoke.
I am glad you were able to give him what for at least. I can't imagine, and you can talk so freely about it. I don't know how. Oh, hi Henry. Didn't expect to see you in here. You want to pull up a seat and join us?
Alira turned to find Henry standing at the door, a look she'd learned to call pensive on his face.
Thank you for the offer, ladies, but I'm afraid not. I need to borrow Alira for a little bit. Finish your lunch, then come to my office. I want to get your opinion on something.
She nodded to him.
Of course, sir. Whatever I can do to help.
He gave her a slightly bemused smile, and she realized that she had stood, pointed her snout downwards, and clasped her hands in front of her, out of reflex. She quickly lifted her head, put one hand on her hip, and looked him square in the eyes.
The ladies and I were having a good moment, and they just introduced me to some of your delightful food, so I intend to indulge myself.
Henry smiled at that, and the girls giggled a little. Squaring off against him had caused her heart to flutter in fear, but his disarming look settled her. How does he do that? He waved a hand.
Not a huge hurry, just a bunch of crop reports out of the Republic that seem odd. The crops won't grow much while you finish your food. If it is crop reports from the ex-Sultan regime, would it be better to let me look at them and get back to you? No, I want to be there to gauge your initial reaction, then talk you through it, and then I'll send you off to pound on it and get back to me.
He smiled again, nodded to the other ladies, and made his exit. She sat down to enjoy her lunch and time with her human friends. She went straight from the lunchroom to her boss's office and found the door open. He favored her with a bright smile when she walked in and gestured for her to take a seat. Such casual courtesy, I wonder if he knows how much it means. I would never have been allowed to sit in the presence of a boss, and they would have kept me waiting outside the door for at least half an hour on principle. After making me leave my lunch behind, Henry hit a few keys on his desk and a hollow display came up between them. She could see it displaying in English facing him and in Cresta facing her. Presumably the facts and figures were the same in both languages. She looked over the display at him.
You can put mine in English, sir. I have begun to think in this language already, and it will probably be good practice.
Henry nodded, but didn't change the screen.
You have made great strides in learning English, and I applaud you for it. That said, you are the one looking at is the original data, and I'm looking at a translation, so it's probably better to leave it as is. I brought the display up without explanation, because I want to get your opinion of what you see on the screen, without any preconceptions my words might give you. Take your time and think on it.
He then turned away from her and began to poke at another display. She had to suppress a smile. Such trust. Her old employers would have sat there watching her every moment, looking for clues to her thoughts, hints of deception, or indications that she was not staying on task. She leaned forward and looked at the data, then brought her talon up to follow a line, and was shocked again when the display moved under her touch. He unlocked the display for me. She felt a strange thrill of power. To be able to directly access the boss's computer. The humans probably considered this normal, but she had once been disciplined, harshly, for even attempting something of the sort in a moment of frustration. She shook off her ruminations and tried to focus. The report was a standard crop yield report, the sort of thing which had been her bread and butter, as the humans liked to say in the days before that voter had dragged her to his bed. She scrolled through the reports with practiced ease. It felt good, in a strange way, to be reading her native language again, and paging through the sort of reports she had been trained to interpret. It also felt very familiar. If she could ignore the smell of the human sitting across from her, she could almost imagine herself to be back at her old job. The numbers scrolled by in the patterns she remembered so well. Wait. No, that's not right. I've been looking at the quarterly yield column and confusing it with the annual yield. Maybe I have forgotten more than I thought. I mean, it has been a while. A few more minutes of scrolling and putting numbers together increased her confusion. Okay, the reason I was confusing the columns was the numbers in them. It took effort to keep the proper tone in her voice.
Sir, I don't mean to doubt the vaunted human intelligence agencies, but this can't be right. I think your people obtained doctored reports.
Henry turned to her and raised a single eyebrow, so she continued.
These yields can't be right. It took me a moment to realize it, because at first I thought those quarterly reports were low-end annual report. Even you, humans, with that crazy death world grain you have growing on class 3 worlds, don't produce so much. This looks like what I might expect if you were to take everything the Exaltans know how to do with crops, which they have held back from teaching you humans, and applied them to that same grain you humans have.
Her eyes widened, and she involuntarily took in a breath as Henry gave her a grave nod and then spoke.
That is why I wanted you to look at the numbers without any prompting from me to see if you came to just that conclusion. I have to congratulate you, though. I expected you to see that something was off, take this data off to work with it, then come back with an answer.
Excitement began to well up in her.
This is fantastic. It gives me a great preview of what can be done and what to expect with the changes in your farming methods that you've had me working on. These yields are not as high as I expect ours to be, but then the Exaltans are probably being very ham-fisted in their approach, and not bothering to learn the things you taught me about the various grains. Let me guess, when they bought the seed grain off of you people, they sent some stuffy, arrogant, high-generation voter who insisted that he didn't need a bunch of superfluous information about.
Something in Henry's face caused her words to die off. She cocked her head at him and folded her hands, deciding it best to let him speak.
We didn't sell them any grain.
The scales on the back of her neck shifted into combat readiness, and she had to fight to keep her talons sheathed. A little growl crept into her tone.
That grain is protected under treaty and the patent laws of the League. What did they do?
One side of Henry's mouth lifted slightly in a strange sort of smile, and she realized how angry she'd become. It hasn't been that long since I thought of these people as my sworn enemies. Now, however, I am indignant on their behalf. She looked around the room, then within herself, and the realization she found within startled her so much that she nearly jumped. No, I am not indignant on their behalf. I am indignant on our behalf.